Um, oh, that's fine. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Dr. Zara Brodie, who's a colleague of ours within the centre and the university, and a lecturer in psychology, who has done a lot of research, important research, looking around the whole issue of childhood adversity. And how this relates to violence perpetration and victimisation in adulthood. And she has been involved in looking at issues of domestic abuse and most recently issues relating to sexting behaviour in adults. And we also have Dr. Graham Scott, another colleague in the centre and the university, who's a lecturer in UWS and treasurer of the Cyber-Psychology section of the British Psychology Society. And again, Graham has done a lot of important research into the area of cyber psychology and specifically looking at online impression formation and social media use, and how this can be applied in the context of education, cyberbullying, and sexting. So I'm just going to hand over to Zara and Graham, first of all, to share their insights with us today. Okay.
Thank you, Ross. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides. Fingers crossed we have no technology problems today. So can everyone see the slides all right? Yeah, I'm seeing nods and thumbs. That's a good sign. Okay, so today what I'm going to be covering is sexting in adulthood specifically. So first of all, I'm going to look at the motivations to engage in this behaviour, and then also consider the ways in which sexting can essentially provide a platform for abuse. I'll then pass you on to my colleague Graham, as Ross said, who is going to be discussing sexting and cyber abuse more specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'll pass on to my other colleague, Karen Cooper, who is going to be talking about her research that focuses more specifically on young people and children in relation to sexting. So we're covering the whole lifespan of sexting in the session today.
My apologies, I didn't mention Karen there. Yeah,
Oh, no.
I was thinking Karen was coming in separately, but you're all doing the one presentation. Sorry, so
No,
apologies,
that's
Karen.
okay.
Okay.
So what is sexting as a concept? So because it's a relatively new activity, there's not really a standardised definition of sexting so far. But despite some semantic differences, it's generally accepted that sexting involves the exchange of sexually explicit content via some form of technology. So this can involve the creation, the sharing, or the receiving of sexually suggestive text messages, or nude or partially nude images and videos. So sexting really refers to a plethora of activities as opposed to one specific singular behaviour. And we tend to find that this term sexting that we see a lot in the literature tends to be used more commonly by either academics or legal communities as opposed to something that's actually used by people who engage in sexting. And this is especially the case when we look at young people who sext. So they tend to be far more familiar with concepts such as sending nudes as opposed to actually understanding what the concept sexting means really. So the majority of research that explores sexting tends to focus on its prevalence and predictors in adolescent samples, and there's been considerably less attention paid to sexting in adulthood because a lot of the time there's an assumption that it's not really a risky behaviour for adults. But we have seen a kind of surge in the past few years looking at the extent to which adults engage in sexting. So in research that we conducted in 2019, we found that 77.6% of our UK adult population reported having engaged in sexting behaviour in the 6 months prior to the study. And we tended to find that sexting was quite a popular means of sexual communication within a committed relationship. So there was only 43% of the sample that said that they had sexted with someone that they weren't actually already in a committed relationship with. Now, while the estimates are relatively lower for teens than they are for adults, surveys tend to suggest that at least 1 in 4 teens are receiving sexually explicit texts and emails, and at least 1 in 7 are sending them. And what we tend to see is that sexting behaviour increases as individuals move through adolescence, and it tends to reflect that sort of key point of sexual. It then kind of hits a peak in early adulthood, but then starts to decrease as we move into adulthood and relationships start to become a little bit more stabilised. In terms of gender, there are several kind of inconsistencies in the literature. So a number of studies suggest that males will engage in sexting behaviour more often than females. But we tend to find that this is kind of quite heavily grounded in the way that we measure sexting. So when you break that down and you look at studies that specifically look at the sending and receiving of messages separately, more often the data suggests that males are more likely to receive sexted messages, whereas females are more likely to send them. So this encourages us to begin thinking about the underlying mechanisms or motivations that might explain this data. And at a glance, it could indicate that males might play a larger role in the requesting of this kind of content from females. And this is something we'll explore a bit more as we move through the session. So while there is potential for sexting to reflect a more positive or normative relationship behaviour in adulthood, there are still risks associated with adult sexting. And so it's really important that we don't ignore that adult population when we're talking about motivations to engage in sexting and potential risks associated with the behaviour. So in terms of motivations, many of the motivations that are at the heart of sexting decision making will mirror those that are at play when we're making any kind of decision to engage in sexual behaviour. And just in the same way, not all motivators are going to be fundamentally positive. So the psychology literature on motivations generally proposes that there are 2 wider umbrellas or types of motivation. So firstly, we have intrinsic motivations, which come from within the individual and are determined by our own values and our own goals. So, for example, some adults might choose to sext because it enhances their feelings of relationship security or intimacy with their partner, or perhaps because they enjoy seeing that appreciation from their partner when they send them sexually explicit content. Others, on the other hand, might engage in sexting because they just personally find it to be a passionate and enjoyable form of intimacy, and because it improves their sexual or relationship satisfaction. So it's just a behaviour that they personally enjoy. Then for some, sexting can also improve their own feelings of self-worth. So by perhaps empowering them to feel more confident or increasing their self-esteem, or perhaps by alleviating feelings of inadequacy or insecurity that they feel about their own bodies. So if we're internally motivated to engage in an activity like sexting, we're far more likely to experience personal satisfaction and enjoyment from it. And therefore we're more likely to experience positive outcomes associated with the behaviour. Whereas extrinsic or external motivations, on the other hand, are those that are far more heavily influenced by those around us. So, for example, some people might sext as a means of appeasing a sexual or romantic partner. So this can often be a result of pressure from a partner, where sexting will take place to try and avoid any relationship discord, or even due to feelings of guilt or obligation, where an individual worries that their partner will think they're not committed to them or they're not grateful for content they've sent them if they don't reciprocate and continue to engage in that behaviour. Another common reason to engage in unwanted sexting is to prevent any harm or negative consequences that you think that you perhaps might face from your partner if you refuse to engage. So, for example, a sexting partner might threaten to share images or even just to sever a relationship if you don't agree to engage or continue engaging in sexting with them. And a final external motivator that we find to be quite common is reputation management. So this involves sexting due to concern about your status or your relationships with your peers. So for example, if you see that your peers are engaging in sexting, you might feel pressure to do it as well to avoid appearing different to your social group. And this can also relate to the idea of FOMO, or fear of missing out. So people might sext to avoid appearing to be the odd one out, or to try and avoid missing out on any potential positive consequences that they see their peers experiencing as a result of sexting. So for example, where they see their peers sexting another individual and that eventually leads to actual sexual activity. So generally, these more externalized motivations for engaging in sexting, where the goals are framed in terms of those around us instead of ourselves, they're often associated with more negative sexting experiences and outcomes. And the first two that I mentioned there, that partner appeasing and prevention of harm, tend to be the most prevalent motivators where sexting moves into that more abusive range of behaviours. So we often see that there are quite stark gender differences in terms of reported motivations for engaging in sexting. So females are far more likely to say that their insecurities are a motivation for engaging in sexting. So they report that they will worry that a partner perhaps might not want them or won't love them if they refuse to engage. And females are also more likely to report feeling pressured or coerced into sexting by a partner. So research conducted in the United States found that women were 4 times more likely than men to say that they sent a sexually explicit image in order to prevent the recipient from either losing interest or to prevent the recipient from looking at images of other people. And around 21% of college women endorsed feeling pressured or coerced by a romantic partner to send a sexually suggestive message. However, interestingly, women are also 4 times more likely than men to say that they sent sexually explicit images as a way to feel empowered. And women are twice as likely than men to say that they sent these kinds of images as a means to boost their own self-confidence. So, for women, sexting can, in some instances, create a safe space to express and explore their sexuality. And it's really not uncommon to find that female respondents will select both empowering and disempowering reasons for sexting, which shows just how complex females' motivations can be, and also highlights that potentially women might have the most to gain from engaging in sexting, but comparatively also might have far more to lose from engaging in that behaviour. So, on the other hand, males are far more likely to report having pressured a partner into sexting, and they're also more likely to report more hedonistic motivations. So, for example, sexting because it feels good for them personally, and because it satisfies their own sexual needs. So, this might point to a kind of sexual double standard when it comes to sexting, which we often find to be the case in another range of sexual behaviours. So, when looking at research on sex-related attitudes, men are more likely than women to endorse the belief that men are sex-focused and women are objects of sexual desire. So, this relationship between males and hedonistic motivations for engaging in sexting could occur because males will often participate in that behaviour as a way to satisfy their own sexual needs, with somewhat less concern about the needs or desires of the person on the other side of the phone. Because of these kind of ingrained gender roles, females might also feel kind of more pressured to engaging in sexting as a means of pleasing their partner, and might feel that this is kind of like an expectation or a presumption for them. So, what are the outcomes of sexting? It's been associated with a whole host of health and social consequences, but the literature regarding the outcomes of engaging in sexting in adulthood is kind of conflicted, with both negative and positive outcomes associated with it. So obviously one of the main concerns surrounding sexting is that once an individual sends a sexually explicit message, their control over that content is lost. Control is completely relinquished to the receiver. But there is a conceptual debate within the scientific community that distinguishes between two clear lines of argument. So one side tends to argue for a kind of normalizing discourse, where sexting is a normative behaviour as part of sexual expression in a relationship. So this suggests that it's very possible to practice safe sexting and to avoid any kind of negative consequences. But the other side of this argument suggests that sexting is actually fundamentally a risky behaviour that requires some kind of intervention and prevention measures to reduce or diminish its prevalence in adults. So, compared to young people and adolescents, often adults can differ quite hugely in their reasons or their attitudes towards sexting, and also just their general conceptualizations of the behaviour. So, a number of researchers have claimed that the customary risks that we assume are associated with sexting in adolescents are less applicable to adults. So, for adults, sexting can reflect an adaptive and tactical technique for identifying potential partners. And as I mentioned in terms of the female data, it can actually have the potential to increase sexual agency and empowerment through safe sexual exploration. And adults can also use sexting as a tool for maintaining and improving current relationships. So our own study found that those who reported having sexted their partner in the past demonstrated significantly higher sexual satisfaction than those who had never sexted. And this was found in both male and female participants. Now, we didn't find a link between sexting and relationship satisfaction, but other studies have indicated that this could be far more dependent on how secure the individual perceives that relationship to be. So, in line with this, whether sexting is a positive or a negative behaviour in adulthood can depend really heavily on that individual's motivations for engaging in the behaviour in the first place. So for example, a recent study that we conducted found that those who sext a romantic partner for those intrinsic reasons that I mentioned, so for your own sexual pleasure or to increase passion and intimacy in the relationship, sexting was related to a surge of positive emotion or positive affect following sexting engagement. However, on the other hand, for those who reported that they engaged in sexting for more extrinsic reasons, most commonly to appease a partner or following pressure for a partner to engage, we saw that those individuals reported far higher levels of depressive symptomology and heightened levels of stress following engaging in sexting. So motivations seem to be key to whether this becomes a positive and adaptive behaviour or a negative behaviour with more severe consequences. So, as I've highlighted, the act of sexting can be consensual, and it's not itself a sign of abuse. But while the aim of consensual sexting is, of course, pleasure and communication within an interaction, the goal of abusive sexting is often to harm and humiliate someone. And so sexting can provide a tool for abusive partners to cause distress. So what are some of the ways that an abuser can use sexting? So first of all, an abuser can use photographs, videos, or messages that are shared during sexting interactions to maintain or increase power and control over their partner or ex-partner. So for example, they may later threaten to share images or actually share them with other people. So abusers will often use content that's received during sexting as a form of blackmail, or sometimes it's referred to as sextortion. So this can include the threat of content distribution to pressure an individual into continuing to send sexually explicit messages, even if they don't wish to do so, or even attempting to elicit other forms of behaviour or even monetary gains from the victim by threatening to share their content. And the purpose of this blackmail is generally to dominate the victim's will in some way. An abuser can also harass sexting partners by sending sexually explicit messages, even if the recipient has specifically asked for that communication to stop. So this gives them a continued level of control over what is being seen or being consumed by the recipient. And it also gives them an ability to cause known distress as and when they desire, because they hold that content essentially permanently in their hands. And sexting has also been associated with the perpetration of face-to-face partner violence in adolescents and young adults, particularly in the context of intimate partner sexual violence. So sexting can provide a platform through which aggressive sexual behaviours towards an intimate partner can occur. And we find that this is supported also with research, specifically with perpetrators of domestic violence, which found that abusers who engage in sexting are more likely to demonstrate higher and more severe levels of real-life sexual violence towards their partners. So, where sexting occurs in the context of abuse, the likelihood of sexting coercion preceding that behaviour is exponentially higher. And there are generally three main forms of coercion that abusers will use to manipulate someone into engaging in sexting. So the first that we often see is resource manipulation. So this is where the abuser will withhold important resources or benefits that the individual relies upon until they'll agree to send sexually explicit content. Another common tactic is commitment manipulation. So this is where the abuser will suggest to the individual that failure to send such content in some way demonstrates that they are not committed or that they don't love their partner. And finally, defection threat. So this involves the abuser suggesting that not sending this sexually explicit content would force them to look elsewhere or pursue other romantic opportunities. And abusers will often use a combination of these tactics to try and maximize the likelihood that the individual will give in and engage in sexting behaviour. So you can see real clear overlaps here between these types of sexting coercion methods or tactics and those extrinsic motivations that we commonly see people report as motivations for sexting. So research that was conducted with university students found that 25% of young adults reported experiencing some form of sexting coercion. And this was equally common in both male and female respondents. And their research also showed strong relationships between sexting coercion, coercion to engage in actual physical sexual activity, and other tactics associated with intimate partner violence. So once again, this is suggesting that sexting just provides an additional platform for coercion and abuse to occur. And this study also found that experiencing sexting coercion had severe mental health implications for both men and women, with higher rates of depression and anxiety associated with the experience. And interestingly, participants in the study actually reported a greater impact on mental health due to sexting coercion than they did for face-to-face sexual coercion or exposure to the other intimate partner violence tactics that were measured. So this could be a result of the kind of persistent control that's held by the recipient of sexting content. So essentially, they end up with a catalogue of material that can be used against the individual or shared with the public at any given moment if they decide to. So this means that the threat to the individual can be even more pervasive where sexting is involved. And this has similarly been found in adolescent samples. So a study in the United States that surveyed over 1,000 adolescents found that 12% reported being victims of sexting coercion, and 8% reported perpetrating sexting coercion. And in line with the adult literature, what they found was that girls were more likely to be victims of this coercion, and boys were more likely to coerce partners into both sexting and other kinds of sexual behaviour. And finally, they found that other forms of sexual coercion, including the use of threats and insistence on sex without a condom, were significantly associated with the perpetration and victimisation of sexting coercion. And as you can see from the graph that I've just popped on the screen, they found that victimisation and perpetration rates for sexting coercion were present across all of the age groups that they surveyed. But the most at-risk group for victimisation were 9th grade girls, so roughly those aged around 14 to 15 years old, whilst the highest rates for perpetration were seen from boys within that same age group. So sexting coercion is clearly an important issue in both adolescent and adult populations as a platform for partner abuse. But there are other forms of abuse that can occur within this sexting context. So according to a 2016 survey of 6,000 adults, almost 3/4 of people who send their partners a sexual message of some type expect it to only be seen by its intended recipient. But nonetheless, quite worryingly, almost 1/4 of people that had received sexually explicit photos said that they had shared them with other people, on average more than 3 friends. So while this obviously isn't always done maliciously or with an intent to cause distress, it does bring us to another prominent victimisation issue that's inherent to sexting, and that's revenge pornography. So revenge porn occurs when a person uploads nude, semi-nude photos or videos of someone online, and it's often as revenge after a relationship has ended. So revenge porn falls under this umbrella of non-consensual pornography. And several non-consensual pornography websites actively encourage users to submit nude photos of their ex-partners for revenge purposes. And these websites often will also include some kind of forum or discussion board that allows users to leave derogatory or salacious comments about the people in the photos, which are most commonly females. So one of the first revenge porn sites is anyoneUp.com, was created in 2010, and in a 3-month period in 2011, the site received 10,000 photo submissions. So this website was eventually shut down. However, continually new non-consensual pornography websites do surface, and they do continue to attract a disturbingly large following, which exacerbates and creates a platform for this kind of behaviour. So in 2016, Bates conducted interviews with 18 female revenge porn survivors in an attempt to really try and understand their experiences and how revenge porn affected their mental health. So what they found was that the nature of each survivor's revenge porn experiences was unique and very much varied in terms of severity. But there were several consistent mental health implications that were experienced by survivors. So firstly, nearly all of their participants discussed a general loss of trust in others after being victimised, with many stating that they went from being relatively trusting individuals to rarely trusting anyone after they were betrayed by essentially someone that they loved and cared about and they thought that they loved and cared about them too. So they started to feel like they couldn't trust their own judgment anymore regarding whether or not they were safe with a potential partner. Along with this loss of trust, many participants experienced more severe and disruptive mental health effects, and they saw similar stress response patterns to those that we also see in sexual assault victims, with several receiving official medical diagnoses of things like PTSD, anxiety disorders, and depression. And many victims especially reported becoming increasingly obsessive after the incident. So they would constantly check their phones every morning when they woke up to see if any of the photos had resurfaced online. And they suffered severe anxiety that really disrupted their everyday life routines and their sleeping patterns. So many participants talked specifically about real anxieties in terms of being out in public. So not knowing whether someone you walked past or bumped into had been exposed to the content of you that was surfacing online. So this would really cause them to retreat from social interactions and social networks, and in the end become relatively withdrawn from society. And many participants also noted severe changes in their self-esteem and confidence. So especially this was the case in terms of their sexual confidence. So one participant said that she felt that the naked photos stripped her of her femininity and affected how she viewed her body. And this impact on self-esteem and confidence that was seen in almost all of the participants was put down to the loss of control that they experienced. So one victim discussed how one of the worst parts of being blackmailed and threatened with her naked photos was the intrusion of privacy and the loss of control, which she found to be the most traumatic aspect of the whole incident. And this really supports other research, which has shown that where sexual assault survivors perceive a loss of control, they experience elevated levels of distress and trauma following the event. So many of the participants that were interviewed here reported experiencing several types of control loss as a result of their victimization. So they talked about the loss of past control. So this reflected a loss of control during the incident when the content was made public or shared. They also reported current and present loss of control, which reflected a loss of control regarding any kind of police investigations that were ongoing and any kind of attempts to hold the perpetrator accountable and responsible. But they also reported a really significant loss of future control. So a feeling that they had no way to control potential re-victimization, given that the images could potentially resurface at any time. So once this content was posted online, it was very, very difficult to ever fully remove or feel confident that it was fully removed. So it can make that loss of control particularly enduring and traumatic for the victims. And in addition to the mental health impact of non-consensual pornography, survivors also reported experiencing enduring public shame and humiliation, and a struggle to find or maintain new romantic relationships. So this was usually either as a result of struggling to trust others, or because they had concern as to whether new potential partners that they met might have been exposed to the content of them that was shared online. And many even reported issues in terms of job loss or problems securing new employment, where potential employers had come into contact with that content while it was still online. So this really demonstrates the wide-ranging impacts that the distribution of this content can have on individuals. And in a non-random sample of 1,000 non-consensual pornography survivors, it was found that in more than 50% of cases, their full names and links to their social media profiles were also provided alongside their naked photos. and 20% of survivors even had their email addresses and phone numbers shared online. So this often also led to experiencing offline harassment and stalking as a result of the incident from individuals who weren't even involved in the initial incident itself. And similar to, as is often the case with sexual assault, survivors of non-consensual pornography often experience some form of societal blame for their victimization. So from a risk management perspective, incidents of sexual victimization are worryingly kind of considered part and parcel of life in our society. And to counteract it, women are often encouraged to try and take preventative measures to avoid this victimization. And of course, this is a really controversial issue at the moment, and it's really at the forefront of public attention, given the responses to recently publicised cases of assault. So, similarly, we find that many media and online communities will advocate risk management strategies to avoid revenge porn, placing that responsibility on the potential victims to protect themselves. So, for example, one online blog lists 8 sexting rules to avoid becoming a victim of revenge porn, and this suggests that women shouldn't send naked photos to people if they've been in a relationship for less than a year, and they should only send naked photos or videos if their face or any kind of other distinguishable marks like tattoos aren't visible. Another online news website published an article about revenge porn, which they titled, "To avoid revenge porn, don't let someone film you having sex." So much like sexual assault prevention risk management, these common avoiding revenge porn propositions place responsibility primarily on the victim, who most often are women, and they have a worrying tendency to, by proxy, kind of absolve the perpetrator of responsibility. But instead, far more work is really needed to focus on those using sexting as a platform for abuse, to address the damaging attitudes and cognitions that are really facilitating or normalizing, in some cases, the perpetration of these kinds of behaviours. And this is where early intervention or prevention measures, such as those that Karen will talk about and Lindsay will talk about later, become ever more crucial in reducing these kind of more abusive forms of sexting. So that's about all from me for now. So I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Graham, who, as I mentioned, is going to look a little bit more specifically at how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on motivations and consequences of sexting.
Thanks, Zara. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is sexting within the context of sexual activity during the pandemic, and try to link some of what that research has shown to what Zara was talking about the potential dangers, and kind of offsetting that against the positive aspects and the positive outcomes of sexting, and then trying to have a look at what groups are maybe more at risk, and how what we've learned happened over the pandemic will potentially persist into post-pandemic life if we ever get there, and also what groups could be most at risk going forward. So we know for the last year and a half or so, we've been exposed to this highly contagious coronavirus, and we've been, as a population, encouraged to avoid close physical contact with people. So physical distancing has been introduced. We've been discouraged from non-essential contact, and at the height of this, we've been in lockdown, where we've been essentially subjected to enforced physical distancing and discouraged from seeing people outside our own households. And this means not having sex with people outside our own households, or risking breaking the law and being judged by people and potentially catching the virus. So to try and combat this, the kind of world's narrative on sexting and about different cyber sexual activities changed. So up until this point, it had been seen as a negative thing, and what had been focused on was the potential dangers. But after, well, during lockdown, there was a kind of acknowledgement that there were positive aspects to this kind of behaviour, and so it was actually encouraged. So the New York Department of Health said to people that if you normally make a living by having sex, or if you normally travel to see a partner for sex, you should consider taking a break from in-person dates and replace these with video dates or by sexting. The International Society for the Study of Women's Sexual Health said that the new safe sex was e-sex rather than physical sex. So this is a behaviour that was actually encouraged by the authorities. Can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so what we want to do then is to try and see what behaviours people are actually engaging in and what's driving them to engage in these behaviours. So we've seen that social distancing measures heightened people's desire to achieve intimacy through a digital means, because achieving it through a physical means was taken away from them. And the deprivation of sexual pleasure has been shown to be associated with all sorts of negative psychological consequences, so anxiety, grief, loneliness, substance abuse, and poor coping in stressful situations. And lockdown was a stressful situation. Also, sexuality is an important part of self-identity, and restriction over the fear of being near other people have put a strain on that aspect of people's lives, negatively impacting physical relationships and therefore psychological well-being. So it became normal for people to practice cybersex to achieve digital intimacy, and this happened on a spectrum. So at one end you had people engaging in solo activities, which is essentially watching pornography and enjoying themselves with themselves by themselves, to engaging in different levels of sexting. So you had just text-based sex messages, sending images, sending videos, and then interacting via webcam and engaging in virtual sex. And what was found was that younger people were most likely to embrace technology for sexual activities, and also for people who were single, the two main motivators were loneliness and boredom for engaging in these sorts of activities. There were also some gender differences. So for men and women, for both of these sexes, they reported that sexual desire within the past 2 weeks to filling in the questionnaire was linked to having technological additions to their sex lives. For men, loneliness was the main motivator for having these new additions. For women, loneliness was also a predictor, but so was stress and desire for sex with their partner. Okay, can you move on to the next slide, please? Oh. Has Zara been kicked out? Oh, she's back.
Yeah, my internet just dropped and stole the slides. Just a second.
Sure.
Hopefully I didn't miss too much there.
Great. Can you move on to the next one, please? That's fine. Yeah. Okay, so there's been several surveys which have been carried out investigating the prevalence of sexting and cybersexual activities during lockdown, and also their impact on individuals. So, and one of these compared different activities during the early part of 2000, so the start of the lockdown, with 2019. And what was found was that there were increased sexual activities between spouses or people living together, which kind of makes sense. Like if you're living together during a pandemic, you'll have this desire for physical intimacy, but also you'll be quite bored, there'll be nothing else to do. So you increase sexual activity with each other. Conversely, there was less sex between boyfriends and girlfriends, and between casual sex partners who weren't living together. And dating app use decreased overall compared with the year before lockdown, but the way that people were using the dating app, if they were using it, changed. So it became less for arranging physical dates and more for texting and chatting and setting up virtual dates. There was a study specifically with British individuals. So there was a sample of 6,500 British people aged from 18 to 60. And it was found that 9 out of 10 people did not have any intimate physical contact with anyone from outside their household. The vast majority of people who did break lockdown rules and engage in sexual activity with someone outside their household did so with a long-term partner. And this kind of activity was more common amongst young people, so people under 25 than older people. And involved in this study was qualitative questions with interviews with a smaller group of participants who had broken the rules, and it was shown that these people hadn't taken the decision to break the rules lightly. They'd kind of considered it and weighed up the kind of benefits of meeting up with someone for sexual contact and against the risk of catching COVID and breaking government guidelines, and decided that it was more important that they take the risk and see their partner for the sake of their relationship and for the sake of their well-being. What was found was that people who lived alone were much more likely to engage in cyber sex and sexting than people who lived with other people, be they romantic partners or other people. And overall, for everyone, the perceptions of sexting changed over lockdown. It went from being a taboo to becoming perceived as a valuable tool and a safe way of staying intimate with people. And many people engaged in sexting through text messages only, but just like the research before lockdown showed, women were more likely to share images of themselves, even though they would potentially be in more danger because of this than males. There was also a specific subgroup which showed an increase in sexting during lockdown, and that is the sexual minorities, so the LGBTQ community. So these individuals were seen to be more at risk during lockdown for a number of reasons. Maybe they were at home confined with families or groups who weren't approving of their sexual orientation, but the ability for them to connect with other people over the internet, including sexting, offered not only the ability for them to maintain intimacy with partners, but to experiment sexually in relative anonymity, when maybe social stigmas and even laws where they were might present them exploring that in real life. Okay, can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so separated couples were often in constant digital contact throughout the pandemic, and this was the springboard that they used for sexting and sexual activities via webcam. And this led to a redefining of recreational sex during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was an online survey of over 1,500 British adults, among which more than 50% revealed a decline in their relationship intimacy during the pandemic. But these were primarily among people who did not embrace technology during the pandemic. There was about 20% who said that they increased their use of technology to facilitate their sex lives, either by sexting or by virtual sex. And within that group, they were three times more likely to report improvements in their sex lives. And there was another large study involving over 3,500 participants from 57 countries, and perceived partner response virtually helped improve poor relationship quality associated with the pandemic-related stressors over a period of 3 months. So for a COVID study, this was rather longitudinal. So it was showing that when couples did embrace this, then it did help them achieve an intimacy which they wouldn't have had without using the technology. But having said that, even incorporating technology into people's sex lives, even though there was a benefit in that, it's obviously not as gratifying as in-person activities. So these couples still weren't as happy as couples who were cohabiting during the lockdown. There have been a few studies which have reported virtual sexual activity being related to negative outcomes. So loss of interest in partner sex, sexual dysfunction, depression, and anxiety are the most common ones. But all of these that I could find didn't differentiate between kind of person-to-person cyber sex, so like sexting or virtual sex, and solo activities, so watching pornography by yourself. And previous research before the pandemic already linked excessive pornography use to these negative outcomes. So I think there might be a bit of a confound there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, but there's potential barriers and potential dangers of this online sexual activity. So it's easier for some people to engage in sexting than others. So two types of relationships which were not especially easy to maintain virtually through the pandemic were extramarital relationships and relationships by young people. And both of them were caused by what's called capable guardians in the house. So if you're conducting an extramarital relationship, then it's obviously harder to find somewhere to meet up physically, and it's harder to find somewhere to sext or do anything virtually if your spouse is living in the house with you. If you're a young person, then it's harder to find privacy to do anything virtual if you're living with your parents and having them wondering what you're doing online. There's also potential other dangers. So although over the pandemic, cyber sex has kind of become viewed as the new safe sex and the kind of perception of sexting has shifted, there's still all the potential dangers that there were that Zara discussed before the pandemic, and there's still all the risks that there were before. So there's been a few studies which have looked at these specifically. So I'm going to just outline one of them. Can you go into the next slide? Yeah. Okay, so Gasso and his colleagues looked at the prevalence of sexting and online sexual victimization behaviours during lockdown and how social distancing affected these behaviours. So this was conducted with about 300 adults, most of whom were female, and they conducted a study looking at their engagement in different sexting behaviours and online sexual victimization experiences. So specifically, they were asked about whether they had any disseminated nude photos without their consent, if they'd been pressured repeatedly by someone to send pictures or videos with sexual content, if someone had threatened them to send these kind of pictures or videos, or if they'd been blackmailed with these kind of pictures and videos. And what was found was that actually online sexual victimization decreased during lockdown, despite an increase in the internet use and an increase in sexting over this period of time. There's different possible explanations for this. One is the increased presence of capable guardians. So there's a positive relationship between sexting and opportunity. So there's an association between living alone and sexting engagement. And those that live alone, lived with a third party, be they friends or parents or a partner, sexted less than those who lived with themselves. So the presence of these guardians might discourage engagement in sexually related activities, such as voluntary sexting, but it might also discourage the perpetration of victimization. Also, forced distance might demotivate people to engage in novel sexting. So despite the fact that people are engaging in sexting more, it might change the pattern. So they might be only sexting with people that they already know or that they have established a trust with, rather than sexting with novel partners. Okay, can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So there's three questions that come out of that then. It's like, why do people engage in sexting during lockdown? What kind of sexting do they engage in? And what do they do to safeguard themselves against potential negative outcomes? So Bianchi and colleagues investigated the relationships of pandemic-related stress and coping strategies with different kinds of sexting. So they looked at experimental sexting, in which the sexual contents are shared within a relationship of trust. risky sexting, which implies that there's not the same level of trust with a partner, and emotional sexting, where sexting is enacted to reduce negative feelings and is potentially more dysfunctional. So for this, they asked about 2,000 young adults to complete an online survey about their sexting behaviour between the 6th and 11th weeks of lockdown, where they were confined to their homes for COVID-19. So obviously this is a period where there would be increased feelings of loneliness, frustration and fear, which might serve as motives to get young people to engage in the more risky side of sexting. So what they found was pandemic-related stress directly predicted risky and emotional sexting. Experimental and emotional sexting were positively predicted by a need for social support, and risky and emotional sexting were positively predicted by avoidance and negatively predicted by problem solving. So this indicates that sexting was used as a coping tool during the COVID-19 lockdown, showing both adaptive and maladaptive facets. So you've got adaptive coping, which is looking for social support, which mediated the relationships between the pandemic stress and experimental and emotional sexting. And then you had maladaptive coping, which is related to avoidance, mediating the relationships from pandemic stress and emotional sexting. So this supports studies which show, other studies which have shown an increase in these kind of sexual online behaviours, and linking it to a reduction in physical sex. And it shows that emerging adults started to use sexting during quarantine, and most of them who did this reported satisfaction with their sexual life as a consequence. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so how has lockdown impacted individuals' privacy management when engaging in sexting activities? So the study by Thomas investigated different factors relating to privacy management behaviours during sexting. So they looked at demographic factors, so the age, gender and relationship status of participants, psychological factors, so privacy concerns and rejection sensitivity, and behavioural factors, so was it synchronous or asynchronous sexting that was happening? So was it like the sending of messages, or was it people communicating via webcam, for example? And was it voluntary or unwanted sexting? Did they feel forced into it? So the communication privacy management theory says that privacy management means defining information with potential vulnerabilities as private and drawing symbolic privacy boundaries around it. So like Zara was talking about, as soon as information is shared between communication partners, as soon as you send a picture to someone, it's in their hands and they can potentially disseminate it to other people if they want. So if two partners are engaging in sexting, then to be safe, they need to negotiate together what is private and what is public information within their communications and establish these boundaries. So sexters not only rely on personal information control, but also interpersonal privacy management. So examples of sexting related privacy management would be anonymizing sexts and creating plausible deniability. So like Zara was talking about, not showing your face or any distinguishing marks like tattoos. There's also different categories of privacy concerns. So privacy concerns related to sexting can be institutional, so concerns about the trustworthiness of the platform that people use, or social, so concerns about the trustworthiness of the communication partner. So do you trust WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever you're using to send the sext, and do you trust the person you're sending it to? And also sexting frequency during the COVID pandemic might also be a predictor, depending on how and why people are engaging in sexting. So you move to the next slide. So Thomas collected data from weeks 5 to 7 of lockdown and asked participants about their sexting experience of the preceding weeks. 53% of participants reported involving only individuals they personally knew from offline life, and 43% reported not showing their faces in digital images. So these were the most used strategies classified as personal information control. Only sexting people who had established offline trust and creating this plausible deniability by not showing their face. Age was seen to be a factor. So among 18 to 40-year-olds, age was associated with increased privacy management. So the older you got, the more likely you were to employ these privacy management strategies. But older people, so people over 40 years old, use fewer privacy management strategies than younger people, possibly because they're not digital natives, they weren't as familiar with sexting. Women were more likely to engage in privacy management than men, and are generally more concerned about privacy management. And whether or not people were in a relationship was not related to privacy management. Social and institutional privacy concerns did not predict sexting-related privacy management. So individuals concerned about the trustworthiness of online communication partners or the apps didn't necessarily resort to these sexting-related privacy strategies compared to people who weren't as concerned about it. And this was a bit unexpected, and there's two possible explanations. The first one is a phenomenon called the privacy paradox. So this can be explained with individuals' cost-benefit analysis. So even though they're concerned, they trade their privacy for the other benefits that they see they would get from engaging in sexting. There's also privacy fatigue. So by spending maybe more time online, users become emotionally exhausted and feel cynical about different aspects of online privacy, and therefore aren't as vigilant about their privacy management. The researchers also controlled for whether participants had given into sexting even though they didn't want to do it, so whether or not they'd be persuaded to do it even though they didn't want to. And this was marginally significant. So this is also relevant for privacy management. If you feel coerced into ending a sex, you're more likely to engage in these privacy management strategies. Okay, so in individuals with low and mean levels of social isolation, frequent asynchronous sexting was associated with more sexting-related privacy management. But in individuals with high levels of social isolation as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown, the positive effect of asynchronous sexting frequency disappeared. So this suggests that in a state of social isolation, even experienced sexters who are more likely aware of the privacy problems and protections might ignore these and stop using these privacy protection strategies. Okay, can you move on to the next slide? So I'm almost finished. I just want to address the impact of lockdown on a specific group of individuals, so adolescents, before I hand over to Karen. So Nelson conducted a study last year where he looked at 14 to 17-year-old males in the US, and he found that the issues faced by other people in lockdown were especially prominent with adolescents. So not only were they worried about COVID-19, most of them were physically distancing, most of them more adolescents than kind of young adults in their early 20s followed the rules and maintained physical distancing, possibly because they were under the influence of their parents. So they had a reduced ability to socialize, and they were seeing their partners in person less often. And this had several negative effects on their mental health. And many described being physically distant from their sexual partners, and some noted an increase in connecting with these partners virtually, such as sexting and video chatting, but not as much as for an adult population. Okay, next slide. So a study by Jager compared adolescents and young adults' romantic relationship and sexual activity before and after social distancing rules. So there was about 350 participants, and the adolescents were aged 13 to 17, the adults 18 to 21. And what they found was that of the adolescent group, 37% were in a relationship and 28% spent time with their partner during the early COVID-19 pandemic, which was less than in the young adult group. So the youth also spent less time with their partners than before the pandemic. And most young adults were more likely to spend time with their partners and have sex during the restrictions than adolescents. And most youth were not involved in sexting or dating before or during the pandemic. So adolescents are less likely to break the lockdown rules to see a partner, possibly because of the presence of the capable guardians within their homes, possibly because of the legal issues. So if they're under 18, then there's potential legal ramifications from sending these type of images as well. But this means that they're more susceptible to the negative impacts of lockdown and reduced physical intimacy that they might otherwise have been able to enjoy. Okay, next. Yeah. Okay, so why do adolescents engage in sexting? I realize I've been talking for a while, and this has been covered by Zara. So I'll just move on to the last slide. I'll skip over this one. Yeah. So there was a study done which looked at why adolescents engage in sexting over the pandemic period. And it looked at about 500 adolescents, so 12 to 18 years old, engaging in different types of sexting behavior. So first type was just textual sexting behavior. Type 2 was visual content with underwear or swimwear. The third type was visual depiction of private parts, and type 4 was visual depiction of sexual acts. So what was found was that arousal needs were the most common reasons to sext between adolescents during the lockdown pandemic. Higher arousal needs were linked to higher frequencies of sexting for everything apart from the depictions of sex acts. And the second biggest predictor was relational affirmation. So textual and visual content with underwear and swimwear was predicted by individuals needing affirmation in a relationship that they had. Partner pressure was related to sexting, but only the more explicit types of sex, so where private parts or sex acts were shown. And the study's findings offer explanations for changes in adolescent sexual behaviour after the pandemic, and possibly the dual nature of its effects during the pandemic as well. Okay, so that's my last slide. So I'm going to pass over to Karen now, who will talk about adolescence, I think.
So Karen has her own slides on her end, so I've stopped sharing so that you can share now, Karen.
Thank you. I'll just try and do that now. Is that okay? Can everyone see that? Okay, yep. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so hopefully this presentation will just build on many of the kind of issues that Graham and Zara have already talked about a bit. But yeah, the focus will be on adolescents, so young people and children and their experiences of sexting. So I'm going to talk specifically about a study I was involved in, which was completed a few years ago now. And prior to this study, a lot of the research in this field was done around surveys. So people were finding out who was sexting, what their characteristics were, how often they were sexting, but there wasn't really much information about how it felt to be part of the process and what that involved for children. So our research was about putting the young person at the centre of it, about hearing their voices and learning, excuse me, learning about what was going on for them. So before I get into that, I'm just going to kind of outline a few sort of contextual issues. I mean, Graham's mentioned the kind of impact of the pandemic and how people have been moving online for their relationships and everything. But a recent kind of all-party parliamentary group review, which I think was published last month, really kind of drew attention to this and showed the dramatic rise in self-generated content. So the Internet Watch Foundation recorded 117% increase in 2021 in the first 6 months of the year on child sexual abuse material, which is created by young people themselves using smartphones and webcams. And that was already on the back of a huge increase last year as well. So the numbers of images are really increasing and that's been highlighted a lot by the pandemic. And so we're at the stage now, and they estimate about 1 in 7 children of secondary school age have been asked to send self-generated images or messages. So it's really high level, and despite the fact that it is illegal and young people are being told constantly about the risks, this is something that they're still engaging in and in many cases still being coerced into doing. So one thing that has come out of the research is that there's not really adequate support services to deal with people who have had traumatic experiences with sexting. So this is true of adults as well. But with children especially, they need a kind of more targeted response, and there's not always been the resources there, and particularly when it comes to peer-on-peer sexual abuse. So there's a kind of perception that there's adults targeting and grooming young people all the time, but actually a lot of what goes on is within the school environment and between peers, and it's down to the schools and the teachers to try and to deal with that, and they don't currently have the resources to do so. And I'll come on to that a bit later on. But work's also needed to inform parents and carers as well about the real experiences of the young people. So just on that note, that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the project I'm talking about was called Self-Produced Images, Risk Taken Online, or SPIRITO it was known. And it was completed in 2015. It was a big EU-funded project across 3 countries. So we worked with Sweden and Germany and with CEOP, the National Crime Agency, to develop resources to sort of highlight more about the issues going on. So our aim was to, as I said, speak to the young people themselves to find out what they were doing, how they were engaging, how they were creating images, and any consequences for them. And then on the back of that, to develop training materials for professionals to work with CEOP to develop kind of resources that would help enable discussion and to share knowledge amongst practitioners going forward. So it was a three-stage approach, and the first one involved looking at an Interpol database. So it's quite a long title, International Child Sexual Exploitation Image Database. So that captures images of young people from around the world, and it's able to look at the images and assess what's going on. So we looked at from 2006 to 2015 and found a year-on-year increase in the number of children identified in these images. So as you can see, that trend has continued through, and now we're looking at it accelerating again. And what was interesting was the vast majority of those self-produced sexual images were in the context of a coercive relationship. So young people were being coerced or pressured into sending these images in some way. So that was the background. And then we followed up with qualitative interviews, just looking at, as I said, their experiences of taking and sending images, and then communicated that to professionals through workshops, where we kind of introduced we did 4 animated films, which kind of addressed each of the core issues that we found, the core themes from the research. So what we wanted was a real kind of cross-section of young people to speak to. So the criteria was that they were aged 12 to 25, but before the age of 18, had actually themselves created and sent or posted nude or nearly nude images. So we went to community youth groups, schools, the police, went to youth groups like LGBT youth groups, practitioners, Facebook page, so they could, young people could contact us directly. So it was really to get a broad group of young people. And as I said, we asked them about the context, about the images themselves and how they recognise risks, if they did recognise risks, and also what, if any, the consequences were and what they would recommend as needing to be done from their experiences. And we ended up with 51 face-to-face interviews. So these were really kind of in-depth exploratory interviews, and 41 of these were in the UK. So I was part of the UK team based at Edinburgh University, and conducted these interviews. And we also had 10 in Sweden, and they were all recorded and kind of analysed. And their average age was 17 and a half, but we spoke to young people as young as 13 who'd been sending images, and as old as 23. And we did manage to achieve quite a mixed sample. So 31% were female, 62% classified themselves as heterosexual, and there was 20% bisexual, and there's a lot more diversity in the sample. So it was a good mix of people that we managed to speak to. And this kind of word cloud just kind of summarizes all the issues that came up during the course of the interview. So whilst we sort of had a schedule to guide the discussion, we wanted them to kind of really talk about what was important. So a lot of the issues that Zara mentioned and Graham mentioned are there, you know, so people talking about romance and sex and flirting and excitement and relationships, but also issues about coercion and trust, which I'll come on to because these were very core to the whole experiences, but also social expectations and advice. So there's a broad range of discussion, and I'll just address some of that today. But what we did find is that, like with adults, it can be seen as a routine and normal part of daily life. So nobody is kind of shocked by this within the teenage environment. They know it goes on, and despite the fact they know it is illegal, it's still something that they're confident to engage in and routinely understand. But what was interesting is it's not a kind of spur of the moment decision. Most of the time it was a really carefully considered decision, and it was usually in response to a request. It wasn't the case that people were going on and just sending images because they felt like it. It tended to be part of a process, and we found that they engaged in texting prior to sexting, and these messages became more intimate as it went along, and it gave young people time to think about what they were doing and if they wanted to do it. And perhaps unexpectedly, this tended to be at home in the evening, in the early hours. And as Graham said, when the guardians aren't around, it's a lot easier. So obviously that was the time when people felt they could really kind of engage with people and send the messages they wanted to. But this wasn't all about coercion. There's a lot of positive motivations. So again, it's very much like the adult relationships. It's for fun, excitement, flirting, exploring sexuality, part of a sexual relationship. So these were all accepted by the young people, and they were seen as positive outcomes of sexting. But when we actually broke down the process a bit more and asked them about how they felt during the time that they were creating the images and sending the images, this kind of summarizes the different responses. So the main one was worried, which is probably, you know, unexpected, but it was kind of, it wasn't just that they picked out one emotion. So things like excited are there as well as uncomfortable. It's almost like a spectrum. So that at one end, people felt a bit silly or cheeky or liberated. And at the other end, it was people who were feeling really under pressure. They were feeling horrific and dirty. But these weren't kind of static either. So even from 1 minute to the next, people could feel different emotions. So it was a really kind of complex process. And there's lots of emotions going on there for the young people to deal with, particularly because they by themselves usually, and they're not quite sure about what they're doing. So yeah, it was a lot more complex than we were expecting. And one of the kind of issues today, I guess, is about managing risk. And we found that young people weren't naive. They really understood what the risks were. They'd been told about the risks, and it was a choice to kind of accept those risks and to join in and to participate in sexting. But the way they dealt with it was to kind of work out what they felt was safe versus what was unsafe. And that meant that they needed to feel in control. So even as an outsider, if we could see they weren't actually in control, for them, if they felt they were in control, that minimized the risks. So at the time, Snapchat was a really big app that people were using, and some of the younger 13-year-olds didn't realize that you could screenshot. So they felt that the image would disappear straight away. It was a lot safer. So they were doing things like using Snapchat rather than sending a text. Another one, which I think Zara mentioned, was excluding features such as their face or tattoos so that they couldn't be identified. And I think the top quote there is this person saying, you know, I wouldn't put my face in it because if it was sent on, then they're just going to pretend it wasn't them. You know, that wasn't me, that's not me. So they could just deny it. Using webcams in real time, because you're obviously aware when something's been recorded, so it felt safer. And a really common one was actually asking the other person to send first. So if they were asked and they weren't sure, they would suggest that their partner sent a message first, because then they would have it. And this quote here is kind of summarizes that. So he'd send first, so he'd know if he showed someone, then I could easily always do the same. So it was just kind of managing that risk themselves, feeling like they had that control. Another person was feeling they had control by deciding who could see their images. So they didn't want anyone over 40 or with a certain body type. And that way they felt that they were managing the risk again. But for all of them, like trusting the receiver, such as a boyfriend or girlfriend, was seen as safe. You know, even if they had only been in a relationship for a few days or a few weeks, you know, if it was in a relationship, they felt that they should be able to trust that person. So yeah, it was all about kind of constructing their own boundaries. And I've just put up a few quotes, which I'll leave up here, but this just breaks down the idea of coercion a bit, because it wasn't clear cut in any way at all. I think we kind of couldn't distinguish between people who were under pressure or it was harmful to them, and people who felt it was positive thing. It was very much blurred boundaries, and it could appear in different ways. So what started as innocent and enjoyable could become more aggressive, more less consensual as it went on. So one of the quotes here is talking about egging on, you know, come on, it's only for me, I'll send some back. So it's kind of negotiating. Another person talks about being pressured to send pictures, because particularly for vulnerable people, if they feel that a person wants to be with them and that's the way they can do it, then they're going to send a message to them. Somebody else did it to kind of, because they've been asked so many times, they just gave in and they thought that would be the end of it, but then it led to more. And this process becomes more difficult to get out of. Somebody else is talking about compromise. So, you know, you send me pictures, I'll do something else, because if they're not comfortable with being on a webcam, maybe they'll send pictures instead. So it's all about pushing the boundaries, pushing this level of coercion as things change. And some people were able to stand up to that, and other more vulnerable people weren't able to. So, for example, someone who joined some group chats to reach out and to meet people ended up being pressured into joining in to sending webcam material. And they wanted to trust these people. They felt like they were their friends. And so it led to something that they couldn't quite control at the end. So there were lots of different forms of coercion. So just to summarize the study, really, although people were affected, and I think Zara talked about this, emotionally, and the mental health was affected in a lot of ways, there were no real consequences. So hardly any cases where the police were involved or the parents were involved or the school. But what was really important is they were all affected some way by the immediate consequences, whether that's just anxiety or embarrassment, and then longer term. So some had occasional worries about an image being shared, and some had real regret and shame, and worried constantly. And it didn't matter if they'd only sent one image or hundreds of images. That didn't kind of relate to how much regret they felt. It was kind of whether they felt that they trusted the person, and if they'd really let themselves down. That was key to kind of how much regret and shame they felt. And this quote here just kind of summarizes it. It was about making themselves vulnerable and open to being used. That's what they really found difficult to face up to. And this is a long-term thing that they're going to have to deal with, and they can still dealing with. So that, yeah, the kind of consequences are fairly long-term, even when they're not actually physical consequences. So, as I said, this was done a few years ago. So just more recently, just before lockdown, actually, I did some more research with one particular group of vulnerable, a group of care experienced young people, just to see how much they were kind of negatively impacted on their mental health and behaviours by being in the social media world. And again, we did focus groups and interviews and some arts workshops as well, just to kind of get them to express how they were feeling. And here we found that whilst being online on social media groups could be a cause for independence and escapism, it also created this space where they could feel even more vulnerable even more lonely and anxious, and particularly females had this ongoing intrusion. And it was usually at this time of night when they were alone, they were in their bedroom or whatever, that they would get these kind of requests for nude images, for disturbing or inappropriate comments. And for this group that don't have parental support and don't have a large network of friends, this was really, really hard for them to deal with. So obviously the kind of issues that we flagged up are still ongoing, and as the increase of sexting continues, there's more and more vulnerable young people who are finding difficulties in coping long term with this. But in terms of the resource development, I'm sure Lindsay's going to talk more about kind of how the practitioners help on this side. But what we found from the young people was it was about starting a conversation, not just about the negatives, because they are aware of the risk, but about the positives as well, and placing that within the context of being calm and supportive and non-judgmental. And this needs to start early in primary school, because kids are getting younger when they're doing this, and it needs to form a real kind of information around relationships and trust and respect, because this is going to help as they develop their relationships as they grow up into adulthood. And also about the receiver and their role, because a lot of focus is on the sender. You know, you're not supposed to send images. When it is discovered, the focus is on this image that's being sent around. They can get a lot of abuse, cyber abuse from this, but very often, at least from the young people's point of view, it's the receiver who may have coerced, who may have pressured, but they're kind of let off in a sense. The focus isn't on them. So it's about making clear that there is more than one person involved, and we need to address that. So this kind of links into children's rights overall. So they do know that sexting is illegal and it's wrong, but they are engaging in it, and they feel they have the right to freedom of expression and privacy to engage and to take part in sexual development and in relationship development, and that's very much a part of it. But at the same time, there is a right and a need for them to be protected from abuse and exploitation. So it's about getting that balance between minimizing harm and promoting their rights to participation. So what we kind of need to focus on, I think, is learning to manage and balance risks alongside the benefits, the potential benefits they could have. So I'm just going to try and draw together all the research that we've mentioned today, really. And I think what comes out from that is that sexting is really varied in terms of its context and its meaning and the intentions of those involved. And we need to distinguish between what is consensual and positive and what is harmful. And it's not about being naive or not understanding. It's more about relationships, people's emotional states when they're involved, and their relationships and in that social environment as well. And we need to look more at vulnerable groups and even neurodiverse groups, whether adults or young people, because lots of people, for example, if you've got Asperger's or autism and struggle to engage with people face to face, this can be magnified online as well. So we need to know how this is affecting them and what support they need, because there is a need for more support and greater practitioner training and resource development. I think there's been a big focus on research in why people are doing it, what the risks are, but there's this kind of gap at the other end about what do staff need and what staff training and resources can help to provide this support for people, not just where the cases involve the police or the big, but for people that just may be struggling with their mental health anyway in relation, and this has just been another kind of trigger for it where they've been pressured and coerced. And these early interventions around school-age children could help promote positive adult mindsets as they progress and reduce the kind of coercion and victim blaming that goes on. And it just really helps to set up young people and to understand about trust and behavioural issues. So hopefully that kind of will lead on to Lindsay's work with young people and just explain more a bit about what's needed next. Stop sharing. There you go.
Unmute myself first. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about the Rosa project, which was wait a minute, I'll just share my screen before I start. Which was a action research project that was set up in Glasgow. So I currently work for Stop It Now Scotland, which is part of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, one of the leading UK child sexual abuse prevention charities. Stop It Now Scotland is a part of that. So I just need. So the ROSA project, so it's reducing online sexual abuse, was established in 2018 and it ran until this year. It was an action research project funded by RS MacDonald and the Lucy Faithfull Foundation as a 2-year pilot, but was subsequently extended to 3 years. It was a tier 2 project, so that meant that we were working with young people who were on the cusp of offending behaviour or who were actively getting involved in harmful sexual behaviour online. I was based in the Holt service, that's a statutory social work service, and I worked within the Glasgow City area. So the pilot, it was set up as a pilot and it included a 1-to-1 psychoeducational programme for work with young people with problematic harmful sexual behaviour and online. And we were tasked with, I suppose, collating data about young people, their pathways into offending, the sexual behaviours, the harm caused, if you like, and working to promote a knowledge exchange around pathways, service provision and what we can offer in terms of prevention. So what is harmful sexual behaviour? This is the NSPCC definition. So that's one or more children engaging in acts and discussions using any image sharing or creating device, which is considered harmful given or inappropriate given their age and stage of development. And they use the Hackett, Simon Hackett framework of a continuum to look at the kind of severity of harmful sexual behaviour. So we know that technology assisted harmful sexual behaviour is where children use the internet or other forms of tech to engage in sexual activity that may be harmful to themselves or others. These behaviours may include taking, making, possessing or distributing indecent images of children, and this also includes self-produced images. Technology-assisted harmful behaviour also includes the making and distribution of extreme pornography, grooming type behaviours, soliciting and sexual harm online. Technology also allows children to overcome interpersonal challenges and social isolation, but it can be addictive, compulsive and erode offline social skills. Tech and the anonymity, I suppose, that it provides opens up the worlds that children may be unable to explore in the real world, and amplify problematic or harmful sexual behaviours in the offline world, such as sexual attitudes or sexual discrimination. Tech can also be used in the intimate and dating relationships to initiate and or maintain or escalate abuse. So in terms of the ROSA project in Glasgow, typical reasons for referrals to ROSA included the production of self-generated images, the sending of non-consensual images, accessing adult images, downloading or sharing or sending indecent images of children, voyeurism. Young people were referred because they were preoccupied with their own sexual thoughts, and that might have been through watching a lot of adult images, a lot of adult pornography. They also might have been pressured or coerced for threatening, in terms of threatening peers for images. Or children might have experienced CSE by an older peer or adult. There were also concerns that children might have been groomed for sexual purposes online by an older peer or adult, or they were referred because of concerns from their caregiver about their online vulnerability. Most of the referrals came from children and family social work services, but also came through self-referrals, parents, police, schools, FCAMs, health, and other third sector agencies that are already involved with that child at the time. So what we've found in research also says that there's 3 types of technology associated harmful sexual behaviour in relation to messaging. There's digital monitoring and control, digital direct aggression, and digital sexual. So typical adolescent behaviours online include the sending of threats and insults and humiliation, the sending of consensual images, sexual pressures, monitoring messages and whereabouts, and demanding passwords to social media accounts. These three types of THSB are often multifarious and enacted across a range of platforms and devices, meaning that they can be highly extensive and highly intrusive. What we found within Rosa, and this was also backed up in the research, was that boys were much more likely to perpetrate digital sexual abuse, that they were more likely to request, demand and share images without consent. Girls were much more likely to perpetrate the digital control and monitoring, wanting to know passwords, whereabouts, locations. But girls were more likely to feel threatened or be coerced or forced into sharing images, even within the context of relationships. But also that there was loads of gender judgments and often double standards about girls feeling pressured to show or share, but feeling more harshly judged when they do. And also that led on to the perceptions of that being a reduced harm because they had consented. And so that led into that culture of victim blaming having implications for young people who are looking for support, and they may feel that, they were partially to blame or less deserving of support. What we found within Rosa was that a lot of the young people were referred because they were viewing adult images, viewing a lot of pornography, and how that played out, I suppose, was a disinhibition towards sexual violence and aggression, really skewed attitudes in terms of sexual relationships and what is a healthy sexual relationships, a preoccupation a lot of the time with sexual thought, and really skewed and unhealthy messages around the ideas of power and consent, about a lack of intimacy, about in fact a lack of consent, loads of gender-based violence, gender stereotypes, body image, racial stereotypes, so loads and loads of really unhealthy messages that were coming through the viewing of adult pornography and using that as a kind of tool for sex education. So just some of the statistics, I suppose, from Rosa over the last 3 years. A third of all the young people that had been referred had experienced some form of online grooming. And that might have come from an older adult, but more generally it came from an older peer. 3/4 of young people, including those with an ASD presentation, had used pornography. But we also found, that there was an overrepresentation of young people with ASD or learning difficulties. A half of young people who experience some form of sexual preoccupation, so pervasive sexual thought, and the most frequent referrals were in relation to the peer-to-peer sharing the images. A half of these referrals were for communication type offences, so that would be sending or receiving images of children, and that was including of the notion of self-produced imagery. But there were no differences found in gender in relation to the possession of images. However, a highly significant representation of females were found to be, I'm getting word, a higher representation of females were referred because they created images, so whether that was consensual or not. Other significant findings showed that in many cases where there was an identified victim, males were much likely to know the victim of their intended behaviour or the intended recipient for the message or the image request. There was a real lack of information around about sex in the law, other than the age of consent, and we did focus groups in school and study groups. We worked with just over 60 young people over the 3 years, and a lot, other than the age of consent, they know what an indecent assault looked like, or a sexual assault looked like, or what an indecent image was, or in terms of consent, there was very little information other than the age of consent. So there was nothing in there about free agreement, there was nothing in there about coercion, there was very little known about the difference between online and offline consent. So young people really need more information in terms of prevention work about, you know, how they keep themselves safe online. Very sparse information was provided about sex on the internet with little knowledge about illegal images, about collecting type behaviours, especially with young people with ASD and autism, and very little, I mean, if there was any discussion about stalking legislation. In terms of other information, there was no enough clarity into grooming type behaviours, especially in the context of a relationship. And grooming was still that, you know, stereotypical, it's an old man who you don't know and he's going to be contacting you and asking for images. There was very little that was known about the process of grooming, or how it can, you know, it can be quite seductive, and it can be over a long period of time. So we really need to do better in terms of our prevention work, especially in schools and youth groups, and working with young people about, you know, grooming type behaviour and what that would look like. That's especially relevant, I suppose, to young people who are socially isolated, or to those who have difficulties making, forming and sustaining relationships online. So in particular, young people with ASD. And what I suppose we surmised is that PSE in school addresses practical issues such as contraception and cybersecurity and how to block and report an indecent message, but they're not offering enough or insufficient information about negotiating consent, and especially for young people who are on the ASD spectrum. So if you have difficulty reading facial expressions, or if you have difficulty you know, managing offline situations, how do you negotiate consent? How do you know when somebody's withdrawn consent? What does that look like in real terms? So I think there are really good resources in terms of the RHSP, you know, resource that's there, but we need to do a lot more work to make sure that that message is going across. So in terms of prevention, within Stop It Now Scotland and within Lucy Faithfull Foundation, we have a Young Persons Informed programme. Generally, this is for young people who have exhibited problematic, harmful sexual behaviour online. So usually these young people are referred to us. It's a short psychoeducational course, and it's developed with the foundation, and it provides a toolkit, if you like, for practitioners and for staff working with young people within this field. The young people, the programme can be delivered online. It's voluntary, so, you know, we need to get the young person on board to actually, you know, undertake the work, if you like. It helps develop responsible behaviour, and it's also opens up lines and channels of communication, so it's getting the family on board to help support that young person as well. Referrals are generally received through children family social work, as I said, but they can come, you know, from a variety of sources, and, you know, to access the support, you would just contact Stop It Now directly. The programme consists of an initial meeting and then followed up by up to 10 hours of intervention. It's a tailored resource, so no young people need the 10 sessions, and some young people are happy with, you know, well, depending on what the needs are. It's a modular toolkit, so there is 11 resources, 11 modules, and it's designed as a framework for intervention. So there's accompanying worksheets, there's exercises, there's facilitator notes to back that up. And we will be going on to roll this out and deliver this as a kind of training for trainers resource, so that we're not the only people, you know, that can deliver this information. We've also just delivered a training course to parents, carers, residential staff, kinship carers, which kind of comes off the back of the Young People's Informed programme, and that was that's available again on the Stop It Now website, and all these resources are free. So the additional modules that are covered are digital footprints, brain development, technology assisted harmful sexual behaviour, grooming, cyber safety, cyberbullying, privacy and security, CSE apps, social media, safe navigation, addictions, gaming, pornography. There's also a cyber booklet that's can be used for parents and carers, and that's available on the Stop It Now website as well. But I suppose what we do is we work through these different modules based on what the young person needs, and we develop a package of care for that young person. A lot of that will be looking at their pathways into offending, about who was harmed, about their knowledge of internet safety and security, about their knowledge of keeping themselves safe online, their knowledge about digital resilience and how they self-soothe and bounce back, and how they face adversity and what they do to keep themselves safe. Some of it will be around pornography, some of it will be about you know, sharing sexual images and consent online, and about, you know, the consent to share that kind of private information, and how to negotiate that as well moving forward. That's, I suppose, what I wanted to provide for you today was just a kind of overview of the concerns that we have for young people in terms of the service provision, and give you an overview of some of the resources that were out there. But if you have any further questions, or if you want to have a look at any of these other resources, or if there's anything else that you need, then feel free to contact us using the email address. But that's me. Thank you.
That's super. Thank you, Karen, and thank you to all our speakers, because it was, I was trying to make notes and there was just too much fabulous information to make too many notes, but it was absolutely wonderful. I'm certainly going to have to go back into that and have a good look over all the slides again, because it was absolutely excellent. So can I just say thank you to our speakers for what has been an excellent presentation tonight. So we are a wee bit behind time, but if everyone's happy, if our delegates are happy as well, if we could maybe stay on for a bit longer, maybe 15 minutes, because we do want to have the opportunity to have some questions based on our presentations tonight. So what I will do, so it's now open to the floor, to the delegates to now please ask questions, please come in. But I will not be recording this. So just to let you know, if we could finish at 6:45, that gives us 15 minutes. And I will now stop recording and throw the floor open to questions. Okay, everyone happy with that? So I'll just stop recording now.